Today I'm going to give you a little rundown on the anti-theft systems. Last Friday I buried my dad. I guess you saw the video I put of that I put together, the slideshow of his wake and everything. He was 90 years old and full of days, and he was my biggest hero in this life. Anyway, the long and the short of it is we got anti-theft systems, and you know, you've seen the little security light that comes on. Passive anti-theft is basically an anti-theft system that's kind of automatic, and that you don't really have to do anything for it to work. Active anti-theft systems have to be set either when you hit your key fob, you lock the door with a key. Some of them have a little switch on the back of the door lock tumbler. And OEM is different from the aftermarket. Typically the aftermarket ones that are the ones that whenever something shakes the car, they'll start making all that racket. And I was at the Indianapolis Raceway on the upper level there, going toward the hospitality booth. Whenever they got ready to start the race, and they shoot these fireworks up that are just boom. They make a big loud sound up in the sky like a cannon. And all of the cars that were in that parking lot out there, there were half a dozen of them, that shock wave from that explosion of those fireworks was enough to shake those cars, and it started a bunch of car alarms honking off out in the parking lot. Oh, that was pretty funny. But anyway, that's the difference between active and passive. Now, the oldest anti-theft systems kind of work like this. They had a patented, thing that they put on some of the older cars, and they used a system of switches. And basically what you'd have is you'd have 9 switches concealed in a box, and the switches were only accessible through little holes so that the switch positions were hidden from the would-be thief, so that he wouldn't know whether the switches were on or off. And so when he goes in there fooling around flipping switches, he just makes it more and more complicated. Now the problem with that is, when you come back, you may remember which switches you flipped, but if somebody wanted to jerk your chain, they could flip a bunch of the switches back and forth, and then you would have a lot of trouble getting back into your thing yourself. When you leave the car, though, you set whatever switches you want, like 6, 4, maybe 2, and then that becomes your combination, but you have to remember it yourself. All right, so anybody trying to steal it, if they were going to be successful stealing it and not just causing you problems, would have to try to figure out, what that combination was. If they missed the combination, the ignition system would be disabled, but you could put a cover on it that was unlockable, where you could open it up and put all the switches in the right position, I guess, if you wanted to. But anyway, that was just something. Now, this 1990 system here, there was a switch for each door. If it's a 2-door, it'd have 4 switches. If it's a 4-door, it would have 6, because it's got 1 for each panel that's going to be open, right? And with the system armed, closing any of the switches would cause the module to flash the lights and honk the horn for a few minutes. Typically the module, when they had just the theft module, would have wires that were feeding a voltage out of those switches, through a drop-in resistor in the module. And whenever a switch grounded, the module would basically detect that drop-in voltage, and it would see that as an event in which it needed to light off the alarm. Right? So this headlight switch, the daytime running light relay, provide ground to the headlights on this one. That's just an interesting little sidebar right there. This particular one's like an eagle talon. All right, and so I thought it was very interesting whenever they did that. Some of the Eagle Premiers would feed power to their, they had a lighting module in them, a module that just controlled the lights on those old Eagle Premiers. It was a weird setup. And of course, Crown Victorias and Lincolns have got a light control module too, but it was different from this one because the module was basically closing the ground circuit for each one of the lights that was supposed to be on when it's supposed to be on. The lights had power going to them all the time, and those lights were annoying and aggravating to fix. But as long as you understand it, you can typically do fairly good figuring out what's wrong with one like that. Later models, like on the 98 Jeep Cherokee, had a body control module, and the switches were going into the body control module, and all these other ones, you see they got 6 switches there, you got 3 more switches over here. Any of those would basically light off that alarm if it was armed. Now this is actually, again, this is active anti-theft. Active anti-thefts keep people from stealing what's in your car, and passive anti-theft keep people from stealing the car. That's basically about the simplest way you could put that. All right, so the scan tool, though, on these, and even in the late 90s, if it would tell you if somebody was having, let's say if somebody was having trouble with the activation of their theft alarm, and when it was, there wasn't warranted for, you know, nobody's trying to steal it, and you could actually go into the scan tool and it would tell you the last time the alarm was triggered, which switch did it. That's really, really handy. They would also tell you on some of these DRB3 would tell you on these Jeeps, like the last time the cruise control was canceled, it would record what it was that had canceled the cruise the last time. You can see how that would be a troubleshooting boon if you're scratching your head trying to figure out what caused it, right? All right, so while troubleshooting an Expedition, this guy, I mean, it was a funny situation. These people had an Expedition that was, when it rained, it would start honking the horn and flashing the lights and crazy stuff like that. And so they were scratching their heads down at a dealership down in Florida, you know, that was just south of the Florida line, trying to figure out why in the Sam Hill this was going on. And the field service engineer had them replace all of the perimeter switches on the doors, you know, the door ajar switches, the same one that feeds the body control information so it turns on the door ajar lights, also the ones, you know, on the ones that have active anti-theft. That actually is, he was thinking one of those switches might have been the cause. So he had them change all of those switches on the doors and on the hood and on the trunk and all that. Well, as the thing came to me, because they were getting ready to buy it back, Ford says, if y'all can't fix it, we're going to have to buy this vehicle back, because it was driving these people nuts. And you know, the people that had worked on it down there in Florida had really tried. They'd run it through the car wash and everything else, try to get it to do that so they could maybe figure out what was going on. And it didn't do it all the time. It would just do it sometimes when it rained, you know. And so, but it was enough where the customers really ticked off. Well, I got to researching that thing, and I found out that Explorers came with perimeter anti-theft, which would be your active anti-theft, but Expeditions did not. But you know, this one here had both active and passive. This one had passive anti-theft, which means it had the chip in the key, but it did not have active anti-theft or perimeter anti-theft. And so the deal was, they had replaced all those switches on the doors for no reason. And so what I did on that one, and I like to, when I got an intermittent something going on, I don't like to jiggle and pull on harnesses and all that kind of stuff, because a lot of the times you'll fix it without knowing what you did, and then you're in trouble because the harness works its way back over and it starts out giving the same trouble again. And so I opened the hood on it, and I just started folding my arms without touching anything, and I looked down in there. Well, I did have a flashlight, a pocket flashlight I was holding, but the point is, I looked and I saw a blue wire that was resting against the corner of a bracket down there, right in on the left, right by the left fender, you know, in front of the master cylinder, outboard. And I says, that, I recognize that blue wire with no trace, you know, that's the one that triggers the horn. And so, and they see, and it also had, since it had this remote anti-theft personality module that read your key fob and all this kind of stuff, and that, you know, operated the door locks and everything. It also, when you mash the panic button, that remote anti-theft personality module would honk, 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 honk the horn and blink the lights and all that kind of stuff. You know, that's part of your panic button thing, you know, your red button on your fob. But once again, this one did not have perimeter anti-theft, but it did have that little blue wire scratching against that bracket. And looking at it real close, I shined my light on it and I moved it back with my pocket screwdriver, and I saw copper. That's the smoking gun. So all I had to do to fix that vehicle was pull that wire back and wrap it with tape. And it didn't probably take 15 minutes to find it, but basically I just got lucky, and I knew what color the wire was going to the horn relay. Well, why was it causing the flashing lights and all? Well, the horn relay, actually that wire leads back to the remote anti-theft personality module, and whenever you're jittering and bouncing that current going into that wire against, you know, scratching it with all, you imagine if you had a scope on, you see a lot of spikes, it sort of screws up the electronic mind in that module, and it makes it do all this crazy stuff. After I taped that wire back and pull, you know, fix the harness like it was supposed to be, they never had that problem again. And so that's just the little, you know, deal right there. What was funny also about that was this guy from Ford was there, and you know how they have these fix it right the first time scores, you know, where people will say, oh, I had to take it over 2 or 3 times to get it fixed and all that. And we had 25 mechanics in the shop, but for some reason or another, when the overall shop, the first fix it right the first time scores weren't like they should have been. And I wasn't at that dealership a shop foreman or anything, although I did help people, sometimes with their troubleshooting. I went in to tell the service manager I had fixed the Expedition, and this guy was standing there and he says, I need to talk to you guys about your fix it right the first time scores. And I was thinking, wait a minute, I saved Ford from a buyback and you're wanting to talk to me about fix it right the first time? Anyway, it was kind of a funny situation. Well, once an attorney came to me and he says that he was at a hotel in Atlanta and somebody broke the glass out of left rear window out of his Jeep Grand Cherokee, and they went in there and stole his laptop bag because it was behind the passenger seat. And his insurance didn't want to pay the claim because they said your anti-theft should have said something. Well, original equipment anti-theft does not respond to a broken glass. Not on that one anyway. There may be some that did. I think James Bond's Lamborghini did in that one that he made. But anyway, the OEM perimeter anti-theft system don't have motion sensors like aftermarket sensors do. Now Ford's got this wrap module. The funny thing about the wrap module is General Motors also, in this vintage vehicle, also had a wrap module, but the Ford one stands for remote anti-theft personality and the GM one stands for retained accessory power. So a wrap module on a GM does a totally different job than the wrap module on a Ford. The wrap module on a Ford, you can actually, if you can get to this thing here, you'll see some numbers on that sticker usually, and those are the numbers. Whether it has a keypad on the door or not, those numbers, it'll be a little 5-digit code. It'll tell you what the permanent code in that module is and all that. And so the Crown Victorias and Lincolns used the driver door module, which was a different setup. There was a different set of engineers apparently that worked on the Crown Victorias and Lincolns, because Crown Vics and Lincolns had a lighting control module and the other ones didn't have that. They had a driver door module and the other ones didn't have that. So and the other ones had a wrap module. So I thought that was pretty doggone interesting. And and some of them, Mustangs would use the GEM module for your fob and for stuff like that. So anyway, there's a whole, you got to kind of know how the vehicle works. Now granted, all of this I'm talking about is Ford, but we're going to talk a little GM too. The early GM system had a discrete resistor pellet. Remember them keys that had that little resistor pellet in there? And it would close a circuit when the key was inserted between these two little contacts. And you see that little module? There's a little resistor, drop-in resistor in there, and there's a detector and a timer. So what would happen is, if that was the wrong resistance, then this would be wrong. The voltage in that program voltage, that timer would be wrong, and it would keep you from being able to start the vehicle. See, cranking, fuel enable input, and starter enable relay control. It would kill the fuel and the starter to keep you from being able to steal it. But it had to read resistance from the key. That was on a lot of cars from 88 to 98 or something like that. Anytime you see that little resistor pellet. The problem was, these little wires in here on that thing, these little contacts would wear out, and sometimes the wires would break. There's the little white wires coming out of that thing right there. And if you got a broken wire, you're basically going to have one that won't start and all that. And see how that's coming apart right there whenever you try to start it. And so you have to replace this and all of the wires going down there, get down there to the bottom where you're going. Anyway, it was sort of an interesting little thing I found. Now, in '93, European manufacturers started using a chip key, a key with this thing in it, this fancy little, wound antenna and all that. There's an antenna hoop around the lock cylinder that triggered a key chip to transmit a number. Ford Taurus has got this in 1996. But in Europe, they've been using it since '93, and it reduced car theft by over 70% because people couldn't hotwire the car. All right, and so that's a fairly simple thing. The only deal with, in these Ford passive anti-theft systems, the passive anti-theft brain could either be in the instrument cluster, or it could be in a standalone module, or it could be in the engine controller. You had to find out, in NGS, we just had to go from one to the other until we found it. You didn't really have any good information that I knew about that would tell you where it was on every particular car. But if you went, for example, with your old NGS and you checked for the instrument cluster and it wouldn't give you any trouble codes for your passive anti-theft, which would be like your B1601 or whatever. That'd be an example of one of those codes. Then you would need to go to the engine controller, see if that would give you any of those codes, like if you had one that wasn't starting. If you turn on the key and that red theft light blinks really fast, that means that it doesn't like what it sees. You can actually have a blown fuse killing your engine controller power, so that it won't talk. On the ones that are set up with the engine controller is the PATS brain, and it'll blink that light. It'll make you think you got a passive anti-theft problem, when actually all you got is a blown fuse because there's a EEC power wire touching somewhere shorting out. But anyway, early Ford vehicles could be programmed with just one key. After a year or two, 2 keys were required. Up to 8 keys could be programmed. Lost keys could be erased. And programming new keys, if you've got 2 good keys, is pretty easy. Turn it on and off, on, off. Put a new key in there that you've got cut to fit. It's a chip key. Turn it on, off, and that one's programmed. If you don't have the, if you're going to use the scan tool to program it, there's a 10-minute waiting period. You know, a lot of them have that so that you won't have to be. You can't just hack in there and erase the key and put another one in there really fast. It's got to take some time. But let's say you don't have the scan tool on those older ones, and I don't think they're still like this, but you could switch on the key and that light would blink. Leave it on for 15 minutes with that light blinking. Switch off the key, switch it back on after 15 minutes. You know, the light would quit blinking after 15 minutes, as I remember. And then it blinks another 15 minutes. The third time you go through that 15-minute cycle, when that light goes off, that key that you switched on there, if it's the key that's got the chip in it, will be programmed to start that car. Now, that's not going to work 100% of the time on every particular car because there's so many different types of passive anti-theft, even back when this was printed, and that was a long time ago. But look at all the different ones of them. And you couldn't just use any key on any system. They always had to be the right one. And some PAT systems prevent starter operation, some only prevent engine start. I was confused by that because the earlier ones I saw would not prevent starter operation, but they would prevent the engine from starting, or it would start and die. And so the first time I saw one that prevented starter operation, I was confused by that. If the light's flashing and it ain't starting, something's not talking. Either a module's not talking or the key is not working right. I've got a little thing I got from Joey Henrich up there at aetools.us. It's a little red thing with an LED on it that you hold it up right close to the place where you put the key, and you switch it on, and if there's a good signal there, that little LED light will blink on that little tool. I think that thing costs about $60 if you want to buy one, but he gave me one just because I wheedled him out of it at the, when I said, hey, I'd like to have one of these, and he just handed it to me. GM cars got a similar system, and they basically had these little hookup down there. And it's an interesting thing. These like to go bad. That little ignition switch part of it, it likes to crap out. And you have to replace those in order to make that happen. And you can see how all that's hooked up. You got a tamper resistor. Whenever somebody's tampering with the ignition switch, it basically causes a problem. It's all about trying to keep people from stealing the car. They even put these old cars nobody would want to steal. Now, when the GM pass lock sensor fails or theft is detected, the fuel system is disabled for 20 minutes. That can be confusing as well. If you've got one, if you haven't plugged in a scan tool, and somebody says, hey, I got to start it for 20 minutes, and then I went back in and got me a soda pop and came back out and fired up. And so that's basically what you're looking at, is a security thing, and you can look on your scan tool, it'll tell you if vehicle theft detection, VTD I think they call it on most of them, is engaged. But that security light will be on too. And that points to a pass lock problem is what it does. Now the vehicles that use oscillators, in other words they use dongle, they'll have oscillators around there. And they look at this detection area. When you walk up to that thing, you know the ones that just have the little thing where you open the door. If you've got this fob, that little thing is going to detect when you're walking up there with that fob in your pocket, just like on that side, just like over here. 80% of the luggage department is covered by the oscillation of this. The indoor electrical key oscillator for the center floor and the indoor electrical key oscillator for the front floor. The funny thing is, there was a very few of these little, I think they were Toyotas, and they had a little thing on the steering column. It looked like you were supposed to put a key in there, but it was blanked off. And so if you had the little fob in your pocket or in the car, you could just turn that thing and fire the car up. If you didn't have that fob with you, you get no starter operation. So my students were there. So one of those vehicles in there, they have some work done on it one day. I had the fob in my pocket. So I got in there and I said, all right, guys, I want you to watch this. They'd never seen this. It was kind of rare for a car to have this. And you may have seen one or you may not have. So I got in there and they were watching me, and I got in the car and I said, would you please start up for me? And I turned the key and boom, it fired up. I said, okay, I'm going to switch you off. And I was like I was talking to the car. So I get out of the car, and as I told this one boy that was standing there, I said, get in there, now you do that. And so he gets in there and says, would you please start for me? And it wouldn't start. And I said, come on, you got to say it the right way, you know. I jerked his chain for a while. Then I said, let me show you how it's done. I got back in there and I said, would you please start for me? I started the car. This guy, he just come up with something I would say. He goes, my goodness, this is one of those voice-operated cars, and it won't start unless it recognizes the driver's voice. I don't know where he came up with that, but it's funny as all get out. But anyway, when you use a dongle, that's pretty much the way that works. So you can look at that and figure it out. The detection area is drawn out there unless you're close enough. See, if you're standing outside, you're not somebody. If somebody's standing right next to you, they can open the door, even if you got the fob in your pocket. If you're standing outside of this, they can't though. You know, that's the thing. So I don't know if I like that or not, but a lot of vehicles have that on there now. And the little oscillators are made. They look kind of like that, and they're mounted at various different places in the car. You see, and so you'll have usually be a triangular setup, like on a Prius. You'll have one in the back, one here, and one here. And so it'll be, if the fob is in that triangle inside the car, then the push button will start the car and all that. And you gotta, this is all part of it, so you can look at that and freeze the tape and have a look at that if you want to. Now this is a bug hunt story. I talked about it one time before, but it's such an interesting story. I like to go back over it occasionally. Nobody else had worked on this car. She just had simply gone out one morning to start it, and it started and died. Now, I sent one of my guys out there with a scan tool to look at it. We didn't have a VW compatible scan tool, so we went to the OBD2 generic, and there were no immobilizer codes that came out of it. There's your little immobilizer light on that Volkswagen. And so you won't get those from the OBD generic interface, but we did get a crank sensor code, and so the heart of the MO system was the instrument cluster. On this 01 model, 01 bug, it's important because you got to be able to talk to the cluster on the VW if MO issues are suspected on this vintage vehicle. Now we checked the spark, found out it would start popping and then go away while the engine was spinning. Looked at some Identifix posts. They spoke at a great length about checking the AC voltage, and it was supposed to be at least 800 millivolts, and it was below that. So we put the sensor and got it up to 1500 millivolts. That probably fixed the stored crank sensor code, but the car still wouldn't start. Okay, so we basically got sidetracked on that. Although, what's really something is if you got two issues that are causing the vehicle to do the same thing. Let's say that we fixed the other one, but we didn't fix the crank sensor. They would think we sold them something they didn't need. So it was really kind of wise to go ahead and fix the crank sensor so it had more than 800 millivolts. All right, which is what we did. Well, got this VAGCOM cable. We plug it into your laptop. And we finished the rabbit trail of chasing the generic OBD code with the VAGCOM software that you get from Rostec. You can basically pull these codes from just about anything on the card, kind of like OEM. This one here said it had a missing message from the instrument cluster, intermittent. See, that was a fault that it had. Using that cable, plugged into the USB port on the computer, and the software that you download free from Rostec. Now you got to buy the cable and all that. Well, with the Rostec software download and the cable connected, we had to know which measuring blocks to select. But once you learn that, pulling the codes from the module is simple, and these were the first codes we got from the cluster. Let's see, key unauthorized intermittent, incorrect key programming. Well, where are we going to do with that piece of information? We got to figure out something. We got to be able to gather the data and sort it out so you can track your way to the problem. Well, even after we pull the codes, if the problem turned out to be an immobilizer problem, I'd be out of business if I couldn't extract the 4-digit PIN from the replacement cluster needed for reprogramming or programming a new key or cluster if one was needed. So he had a tool for that too. Joey did. I got this from Joey Henry. So he sent me this cable that I had to buy from him. The cluster frequently is a problem on these platforms, and a replacement cluster would be the wisest first choice. It's one of the things Joey told me. But I was still thinking in the back of my mind, it's got something wrong with the key. All right, so after trying to start the car, we got these two codes that led us astray. See, immobilizer pickup coil and key signal too low. I'm thinking this has got to be a problem with the pickup coil or the key. All right, and so I had a brand new key brought from the owner of the car. Went and got a new key made at the dealer and cut for her car, and she brought it to me, and it still didn't really do anything. So we had an immobilizer problem of some kind because the cluster was complaining it couldn't see the key. The switch pickup coil seemed like a logical possibility, that coil around there. After all, it receives and transmits the code. Well, we used the VAGCOM. We discovered that while this 01 Beetle had a serial number beyond the 430,000 VIN threshold that separates Immobilizer 2 from Immobilizer 3 platforms, it was outfitted with an Immobilizer 2, which was not supposed to happen. Didn't make any sense until later. All right, we got these codes from the engine controller that muddied our thinking even further. Sorting this out can be a pain. So we got engine start blocked by immobilizer, internal control module processor fault, intermittent, missing message from instrument cluster. Now we actually got on with the Identifix hotline, and he told us to take the engine controller and open it up, see if anything was burned or smell of it, and all that kind of stuff, and whatever. We did all that. We didn't find anything. All right, so we got a replacement key and lock cylinder from a salvage yard, installed it, and got the same results. Well, based on Joey's saying it's probably going to be the instrument cluster, we got an instrument cluster because it couldn't see either one of the keys. So to get the pin from the cluster, we had to get that second cable I'm talking about and use a different piece of software. So we ordered the cluster. Salvage yard asked if it was automatic or standard. It was automatic, but when we replaced the cluster, we got a bunch of codes for transmission solenoids. So this was an older automatic transmission without solenoids, so we need a manual transmission cluster. Use the cluster part number to determine that. And that had to actually send the first cluster we got back because we got all these transmission codes. And then we got the cluster that was the right one using the number off that cluster. Amazing that they had one, Alright, so I got the right cluster but couldn't get it to take the key, even though the measuring blocks 21, 22, and 23 in the cluster indicated the key was okay. I hadn't received those results before. So see how this is running around in a circle? So with a salvage yard lock cylinder and this chip right here that I took out of the original lock cylinder's key, and this little switchblade key, you can take it apart and you can see a little chip in there. We got the code program. We got the code, we programmed the key, and it started up. And that's the first time it had started since we had it in there. Now, see where that thing is? The one I got in the salvage yard, this was all busted up. I don't know how it got busted up, but that's the one I bought and we tried to use. So I threw myself a curveball getting one from the salvage yard that had a bad key to start with. Because the key came with the salvage yard steering column that I bought. So the end of the story was a replacement cluster was the permanent fix. So this is the original Chi and clip. See, that was nothing wrong with that one. See how pretty that one is? That was all busted up and everything. Okay, so what you got to do is you got to be a terminator. What that means is you need to do not stop ever until your job is done. You remember the Terminator? He will not stop ever. All right, so gather good data. Don't expect silver bullets. Realize this job is not for slow thinking, lazy folks. You got to be tough, resilient, very smart, and do this kind of work. You will earn what you get paid. That's what I used to tell my people. In this business, you're going to earn what you get paid in just about any place you work. Now, some people may learn how to play the game, and all that, but that doesn't last very long before they get you out of there. So learn how to do a good job every time without a comeback. That's what you got to do, but you got to gather good data so your troubleshooting will be proper, and you won't make these different errors where you miss something and replace the wrong part, or you just replace the wrong part without checking anything, hoping you get it, and that kind of thing. There's a whole bunch of different stuff I could say about that. However, this represents the end of the video, and I really appreciate you guys watching, and I thank you for being a good audience. We'll talk to you next week.